3 ships, 3 continents, 3 legs of a journey that would move 12 million human beings across an ocean as cargo. The triangular trade sounds like a geography lesson until you understand what it actually was. The most profitable and most murderous commercial enterprise in human history, a business model so efficient that it ran for over 3 centuries and transformed the economies of 4 continents. Here's how it worked. European ships left ports like Bristol, Nantes, and Amsterdam loaded with manufactured goods, guns, cloth, alcohol, iron bars. They sailed to West Africa, where they traded these goods for human beings. Then came the Middle Passage, the second leg. Enslaved Africans packed into ships like sardines, chained in spaces too small to sit up, crossing the Atlantic in conditions so brutal that roughly 15% died before reaching land. The survivors were sold in the Americas and Caribbean, and the ships returned to Europe loaded with sugar, tobacco, and cotton produced by enslaved labor. 3 voyages, 1 triangle, profit at every corner, and 12 million human lives reduced to cargo, to commodity, to the raw material that built the modern world. This is the story of the Atlantic slave trade, the business that made Europe wealthy, destroyed African societies, and created the racial inequalities that still shape our world today. The Atlantic slave trade didn't begin as a massive organized system. It evolved gradually over 2 centuries from small-scale Portuguese experiments into the most sophisticated commercial operation the world had ever seen. Understanding how it became so vast and so brutal requires understanding the economic logic that drove it. In the early 15th century, Portuguese explorers began sailing down the West African coast, establishing trading relationships with African kingdoms. Initial trade involved gold, spices, and other commodities. But by the 1440s, Portuguese traders began acquiring enslaved Africans, first for use in Portugal itself, then for newly established sugar plantations on Atlantic islands like São Tomé and Madeira. This was the prototype, African enslaved labor producing sugar for European markets. When Columbus reached the Americas in 1492, the template was already established. Spain and Portugal began colonizing the Caribbean and South America, discovering that the region's climate and soil were perfect for producing crops Europeans desperately wanted: sugar, tobacco, indigo, and later cotton. The indigenous populations were initially enslaved, but were devastated by European diseases to which they had no immunity, dying in millions within decades of European contact. The solution to the labor shortage was African enslaved people. Africans had some immunity to tropical diseases that killed Europeans and indigenous Americans. They had agricultural knowledge relevant to tropical farming, and crucially, unlike European indentured servants or indigenous people, they were completely isolated, far from home, with no networks or support systems that might help them escape or resist. The economic logic was ruthless. African enslaved people were the most efficient solution to the New World's labor shortage. The trade became triangular because of the structure of Atlantic winds and currents. Ships sailing from Europe to West Africa used the northeast trade winds. From Africa to the Americas, they used the equatorial currents. Returning to Europe, they used the Gulf Stream and westerlies. Nature itself had created a perfect circuit, and European merchants exploited it with systematic efficiency. By the 16th century, the basic structure was established. By the 17th century, it had become a massive industrial operation. By the 18th century, the peak of the trade, the Atlantic slave trade involved hundreds of ships, thousands of merchants, dozens of major ports, and an infrastructure of financing, insurance, and legal frameworks that made it one of the most sophisticated commercial enterprises of the era. Britain became the dominant power in the trade by the early 18th century, displacing Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and France. The Royal African Company had held the monopoly on British slave trading until 1698, when Parliament opened the trade to all British merchants. This competition drove massive expansion. Bristol, Liverpool, and London became enormously wealthy cities built on slave trade profits. Merchants, bankers, insurers, shipbuilders, and manufacturers all profited from the system. The numbers grew staggering. In the 17th century, perhaps 1.8 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic. In the 18th century, the trade reached its peak, with approximately 6 million more transported. In the 19th century, despite growing abolition movements, another 3.5 million were transported before the trade was finally suppressed. In total, roughly 12.5 million Africans were loaded onto slave ships. About 10.7 million survived the Atlantic crossing. The rest, approximately 1.8 million people, died at sea. The standard narrative of the slave trade focuses on European merchants, American plantations, and the horrors of the Middle Passage. But the trade couldn't have operated at the scale it did without African participation, a fact that complicates simple narratives but is essential for understanding the full system. West African societies had their own traditions of slavery long before European contact. Slavery in African societies typically involved war captives, criminals, or people who had fallen into debt. African slavery was different from the chattel slavery that would develop in the Americas. Enslaved people could sometimes earn their freedom. Their children weren't automatically enslaved, and they retained some social rights and recognition as human beings. When European traders arrived on the West African coast seeking enslaved people, they quickly understood that they couldn't simply raid African territory themselves. The coastal kingdoms were powerful enough to resist European military force, and European sailors died rapidly from tropical diseases. Instead, they had to trade, offer goods that African rulers and merchants wanted in exchange for enslaved people. This created a commercial relationship that drew African kingdoms into the slave trade as suppliers. African rulers who had previously enslaved war captives or criminals now found they could sell these people to Europeans for valuable goods: guns, iron, textiles, alcohol, and luxury items. The demand was seemingly limitless. European ships arrived regularly, willing to buy as many enslaved people as African merchants could provide. The result was an expansion of African warfare and enslavement driven by European demand. Kingdoms that had fought occasional wars for territory or prestige now fought wars specifically to capture people to sell. Criminals and debtors who might previously have been punished or sold into domestic slavery were now exported. Kidnapping of free people became common. Some African polities built their entire economies around supplying enslaved people to European traders. The Kingdom of Dahomey in modern Benin is perhaps the most dramatic example. Dahomey built a powerful, centralized state whose primary economic activity was raiding neighboring peoples, enslaving them, and selling them to European traders at the coast. The Dahomey army conducted annual slave raids, bringing back thousands of captives. The king's treasury filled with European goods. Dahomey became one of the most powerful kingdoms in the region, its power built entirely on the slave trade. Other West African kingdoms, particularly the Ashanti in modern Ghana and the Oyo Empire in modern Nigeria, also became major suppliers to the Atlantic slave trade. These kingdoms grew wealthy and powerful partly through trade with Europeans, acquiring guns that gave them military advantages over their neighbors, whom they then raided for more enslaved people. European demand had created a self-reinforcing cycle of warfare and enslavement across West Africa. But portraying African kingdoms as simply greedy collaborators misses the complexity. Many African rulers and communities tried to resist the slave trade. Some kingdoms refused to participate. Some fought against slave-raiding neighbors. Some tried to negotiate with European powers to limit the trade. But the economic incentives were enormous, and the guns that European traders supplied to slave-trading kingdoms gave them military advantages that made resistance difficult for their neighbors. The full human cost to Africa is almost impossible to calculate. Beyond the 12 million people directly enslaved and transported, millions more died in the wars and raids that produced enslaved people. Entire communities were destroyed, disrupted, or forced to migrate. Productive agricultural land was abandoned as people fled slave raiding. African societies were destabilized, populations depleted, and development potential crippled by the trade's effects over centuries. Some historians estimate that the total human cost to Africa, including deaths in wars, raids, and the Middle Passage, and accounting for population growth that didn't happen because of the trade, may have reduced Africa's population by tens of millions compared to what it would have been without the slave trade. The demographic impact was catastrophic and long-lasting. The Middle Passage, the second leg of the triangle from Africa to the Americas, was the most terrifying experience most enslaved people could imagine. Nothing in African experience had prepared people for being loaded onto ships and transported across an ocean for weeks in conditions designed to maximize profit while minimizing cost. The ships used in the slave trade were specifically modified or purpose-built to carry maximum numbers of enslaved people in minimum space. The infamous Brooks diagram, published by British abolitionists in 1787, showed how a slave ship carrying 454 people could be legitimately loaded, with each person allocated a space roughly 6 feet long, 16 inches wide, and 2.5 feet high. In practice, ships were often more heavily loaded, with people chained in spaces where they couldn't sit upright or turn over. Enslaved people were typically separated by sex and age. Men were usually chained in pairs, their wrists and ankles shackled to prevent resistance. Women and children were sometimes given slightly more freedom of movement, though this also made them more vulnerable to sexual assault by crew members. The hold was divided into decks with only a few feet of clearance between them. The only way in or out was through hatches. The conditions during the crossing were indescribably awful. Heat in the hold was extreme, sometimes reaching temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, in tropical latitudes. The air, already foul with the smell of hundreds of unwashed bodies, was further contaminated by vomit, urine, feces, and the waste from dysentery, which spread rapidly in the conditions. People who were sick and dying lay chained next to the healthy, spreading disease. Food and water were provided in minimal quantities, enough to keep people alive but not enough for comfort or health. Meals were typically twice daily, a gruel of boiled beans or corn, occasionally supplemented with small amounts of salted meat. Fresh water was rationed. People were desperately thirsty throughout the crossing. Some enslaved people, driven mad by thirst, drank seawater, which accelerated their deaths. Exercise was sometimes forced. Enslaved people were brought on deck in small groups and made to dance, essentially to jump up and down. The purpose was to prevent the muscular atrophy and illness that came from lying immobile for weeks. But the forced dancing, combined with beatings when people refused to move, was its own form of brutality. The mortality rate was appalling. On an average voyage, roughly 15% of enslaved people died before reaching the Americas. In particularly bad voyages, mortality could exceed 50%. The primary causes were dysentery, smallpox, scurvy, and other diseases, combined with malnutrition, dehydration, and the general physical and psychological trauma of the crossing. Suicide was also common. People threw themselves overboard when possible, or refused to eat and starved to death, preferring death to slavery. Resistance occurred despite the chains and surveillance. Small rebellions were common. People refused food, attacked their captors when opportunities arose, or organized collective action. Major slave ship revolts were less common, but did occur. The most famous was the Amistad Revolt of 1839, when enslaved Africans seized control of a Spanish ship, killed most of the crew, and attempted to sail back to Africa. They were eventually captured near the American coast, and their case became a landmark in American legal history. Ship captains and crews dealt with resistance through extreme violence. Beatings were routine. People who refused to eat were force-fed through metal devices. Those who led or attempted resistance were killed, often publicly, as a warning. The slaveholders and their agents had developed systematic techniques for controlling enslaved people through terror and violence that would be further refined on American plantations. The bodies of those who died during the Middle Passage were simply thrown overboard. There were no burials, no ceremonies, no records beyond a notation in the ship's log. The 1.8 million people who died during the crossing were literally erased, their remains scattered across thousands of miles of ocean floor. It is one of the largest unmarked graveyards in human history. Those who survived the Middle Passage arrived in the Americas to face a different kind of horror, the plantation system. The enslaved people who landed in the Caribbean or the American South entered a world designed to extract maximum labor from human beings while maintaining their subjugation through terror and dehumanization. The Caribbean sugar plantations were the most brutal. Sugar production was incredibly labor-intensive and physically demanding. Cutting sugarcane required sustained hard labor in intense tropical heat. Processing the cane in mills was dangerous work, where accidents were common, enslaved people regularly losing limbs to the machinery. Boiling the cane juice was conducted around the clock during harvest season, with enslaved people working 18-hour shifts in unbearable heat. The mortality rate on Caribbean sugar plantations was so high that the enslaved population couldn't maintain itself through natural reproduction. Planters calculated that it was more economical to work enslaved people to death and buy replacements than to provide conditions good enough to maintain health and allow families to form. The average life expectancy for an enslaved person on a Jamaican sugar plantation was about 7 years after arrival. This brutal calculation meant continuous demand for new enslaved people from Africa. On North American cotton and tobacco plantations, conditions were somewhat better, in the sense that enslaved people could maintain their population through natural reproduction. This made the American South less dependent on continuous imports from Africa, and the internal slave trade within America became enormously important. When the external slave trade was legally abolished in America in 1808, over 1 million enslaved people were subsequently sold from the Upper South to the cotton plantations of the Deep South, tearing apart families and communities. The legal framework of slavery across the Americas was designed to completely deny the humanity of enslaved people. In American law, enslaved people were property, not persons. They couldn't legally marry, though marriages were sometimes informally recognized. Their children were automatically enslaved, belonging to the mother's enslaver. They couldn't own property, enter contracts, testify in court against white people, or learn to read and write in many states. The entire legal system was organized to support and perpetuate the institution of slavery. Physical violence was fundamental to maintaining slavery. Overseers used whips as routine management tools. Enslaved people were beaten for working too slowly, for perceived disrespect, for attempting to escape, for any behavior that owners or overseers decided to punish. Extreme punishments were used to terrorize enslaved populations, branding with hot irons, mutilation, torture, and death. These extreme punishments were legal and socially accepted. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women was systematic and widespread. Enslaved women had no legal protection against rape by enslavers or overseers. Sexual assault was common, and the children of such assaults were automatically enslaved, increasing the enslaver's property. Some enslavers deliberately encouraged enslaved women to have children to increase their workforce, treating human reproduction as a form of livestock breeding. Despite all of this, enslaved people maintained their humanity, their cultures, and their resistance. African religious practices, musical traditions, linguistic patterns, and cultural values survived in modified forms, becoming the foundation of distinctive African American cultures. Families formed and maintained bonds despite legal non-recognition. Communities developed mutual support systems. People resisted through subtle daily acts of non-cooperation, sabotage, feigning illness, slow work, and destruction of tools and crops. The slave trade and plantation system generated wealth on a scale that fundamentally transformed the economies of Europe and the Americas. Understanding this economic dimension is essential for understanding why the trade continued despite its evident brutality and why its legacy persists. Liverpool's transformation is emblematic. In 1700, Liverpool was a minor English port with a population of around 5,000. By 1800, it was Britain's second city with over 80,000 people, dominated by merchant families who had built their fortunes in the slave trade. The magnificent Georgian architecture of Liverpool's city center was built with slave trade profits. The trading companies, banks, and insurance firms that made Liverpool a commercial powerhouse were all connected to the slave trade and plantation system. Similar transformations occurred in Bristol, Nantes, Bordeaux, Amsterdam, and dozens of other European ports. The slave trade generated enormous profits at every stage, building and outfitting ships, manufacturing the goods traded for enslaved people, insuring the voyages, financing the plantations, processing and selling colonial products. Entire industries existed to serve the slave trade. The Caribbean and American plantation economies generated massive wealth for European investors and merchants. By the late 18th century, the Caribbean colonies were generating extraordinary returns. The British Caribbean produced roughly 40% of Britain's overseas trade. French Caribbean colonies, particularly Saint-Domingue, Haiti, were even more productive. The plantation system was, by contemporary standards, extraordinarily profitable. These profits didn't just enrich individual merchants and planters, they financed the Industrial Revolution. Historians debate the exact relationship, but there is strong evidence that slave trade and plantation profits provided crucial capital for industrial investment in Britain in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The factories, canals, and railways of industrial England were partly financed by wealth generated by enslaved labor. The American economy's development was similarly dependent on enslaved labor. Cotton became the dominant American export by the early 19th century, and cotton production depended entirely on enslaved labor. By 1860, the 4 million enslaved people in the American South represented the largest single capital asset in the American economy, worth more than all American factories and railroads combined. The financial system that financed cotton production, including banks and insurance companies in New York and New England, was deeply intertwined with slavery. When slavery was finally abolished in the British Empire in 1833, the British government paid £20 million in compensation, not to the formerly enslaved people, but to the enslavers for the loss of their property. This compensation, equivalent to roughly £2 billion in modern terms, was borrowed by the British government and was only fully repaid in 2015. British taxpayers were still paying off the debt incurred to compensate slaveholders well into the 21st century. The abolition of the Atlantic slave trade, and then slavery itself, wasn't inevitable and didn't happen quickly. It required decades of organized political campaigning, combined with enslaved people's own resistance and eventually violent rebellion. The British abolition movement emerged in the late 18th century, driven by a combination of Quaker religious conviction, Enlightenment philosophical arguments about natural rights, and the moral testimonies of formerly enslaved people like Olaudah Equiano, whose autobiography, published in 1789, brought the reality of slavery before British readers. William Wilberforce became the parliamentary champion of abolition, introducing bills year after year against fierce opposition from slave trade interests. The abolitionists used innovative political techniques, mass petition campaigns that gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures, consumer boycotts of slave-produced sugar, public lectures featuring formerly enslaved speakers, and the publication of evidence about conditions in the trade and on plantations. They understood that public opinion had to be changed before Parliament would act. The slave trade interests fought back with enormous resources, lobbying Parliament, funding counter-campaigns, and arguing that abolition would destroy the British economy. They claimed falsely that enslaved people were content and better off than African free people. They argued that abolition would simply allow France and other countries to dominate the trade. The battle in Parliament lasted 20 years. In 1807, Parliament finally passed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act, making it illegal for British ships to participate in the trade. This was a major victory, but left slavery itself intact in British colonies. The campaign continued, demanding full emancipation, and in 1833, the Slavery Abolition Act ended slavery throughout the British Empire. America's path to abolition was bloodier. Despite the legal end of the external slave trade in 1808, slavery expanded massively within America as cotton production grew. The abolitionist movement grew through the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, but faced violent opposition in the South and ambivalence in the North. The contradiction between American ideals of liberty and the reality of slavery could ultimately only be resolved through the Civil War of 1861 to 1865, which killed over 600,000 Americans before ending slavery. The Atlantic slave trade ended, but the world it built persists. The racial hierarchies, economic inequalities, and cultural damage created by 3 centuries of the triangular trade didn't disappear when the last slave ship docked. They transformed, adapted, and continued shaping the world we live in. The most obvious legacy is the African diaspora itself. The 10.7 million Africans who survived the Middle Passage and their descendants form communities across the Americas and Caribbean whose cultures, languages, religions, and identities bear the marks of slavery. African American culture, Caribbean cultures, Afro-Brazilian culture. These are all direct products of the triangular trade, created by people who were torn from their homelands and forced to build new identities in brutal conditions. The economic inequalities created by the slave trade remain visible. The wealth generated by enslaved labor enriched Europe and white Americans while impoverishing enslaved people and their descendants. Formerly enslaved people received no compensation for their labor. They were freed in the American South into a system of sharecropping, Jim Crow laws, and racial terror that maintained their economic subjugation for another century. The wealth gap between black and white Americans today traces directly to slavery and its aftermath. Africa itself bears the scars. The regions most intensively raided for enslaved people, particularly West Africa, experienced population loss, social disruption, and institutional damage that affected development for generations. Some historians argue that the slave trade is one significant factor in explaining why sub-Saharan Africa remained poorer than other regions even after colonialism ended. The people who were taken were often the youngest and most able-bodied, the most valuable demographic for development. The racial ideologies created to justify slavery also persisted long after the institution itself ended. Slavery required a justification, a reason why it was acceptable to treat some human beings as property. That justification was racism, the claim that African people were inherently inferior, less intelligent, less feeling, less human than Europeans. These ideas, developed and elaborated over centuries to justify the slave trade, became embedded in European and American culture, science, medicine, and law. Removing them has proven enormously difficult. This is the business that built the modern world, and the debt it created has never been fully paid.